Welcome to Cafe Tales, where every story is a new mystery waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started, Miss Marple and the Murder Beneath the Oak Tree. Chapter 1. The Death Beneath the Oak Tree. The air was unnaturally still in St. Mary Me, as though the village itself were holding its breath beneath the sprawling oak tree. At the edge of the meadow lay the lifeless form of Harriet Forsyte, her cream-colored dress stained with dirt and a broken string of pearls scattered around her. The wind stirred the leaves gently, but the scene remained eerily undisturbed. The oak tree, known for its quiet, shaded charm, now stood as a grim sentinel over the tragedy that had unfolded beneath it. The police had cordoned off the area, but the curious faces of villagers peered through gaps in the hedge. RS murmur drifted on the breeze, a mixture of shock, pity, and speculation in a village as small as St. Mary. Nothing remained a secret for long. Superintendent Craig arrived at the scene, his polished boots crunching on the gravel path as he surveyed the area. His gaze fell on the figure of Miss Marple, who was making her way through the crowd of onlookers. She wore a pale blue dress, a hat tied neatly under her chin, and her demeanor was as serene as ever. Miss Marple credit said, offering her a respectful nod. "I assume you're here to help me see what I've missed." Miss Marple, who had already taken in the position of the body, the scattered pearls and the footprints partially obscured in the soft earth, smiled politely. "I merely came to pay my respects," she replied, though her mind was already working in overdrive. She knelt down delicately, careful not to disturb the scene. Harriet's expression was one of frozen shock, her wide-open eyes gazing at the canopy of leaves above her. The broken pearls glittered faintly in the sunlight. Beside Harriet's handbag lay a crumpled note partially concealed by the grass. With gloved fingers, Miss Marple picked it up and examined the hastily scrolled message. It read, "Meet me beneath the oak tree. There is much to discuss. Someone planned this meeting." Miss Marple murmured to herself. She handed the note to Craig, who read it with a frown. "No signature," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but the tone is telling, isn't it? There's a certain urgency in the handwriting. Attention, whoever wrote this didn't intend for a simple chat." Craig nodded, gesturing for one of the constables to take the note for further examination. "We'll have it analyzed, but if I were to place my bets, I'd say this has something to do with her recent associations." Miss Marple stood brushing her gloves together. Harriet was a woman who made an impression, superintendent, and not always a favorable one, I'm afraid. But such charm can be a double-edged sword. Did she have any particular callers recently? Craig sighed. More than her fair share. Colonel Brandon, for one. There's also James Whitaker, the artist who's renting that studio cottage near the river, and Mr. Delaney, who works at the post office. Though he seems harmless enough, Harriet certainly knew how to draw attention. "Indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. She paused, watching the way wind teased the grass around the tree. "It's not just attention that gets a woman killed, Superintendent. It's what she does with it." Craig rubbed his chin. "Do you think jealousy is the motive? Then one of her admirers, perhaps driven too far. Jealousy is always a good starting point," Miss Marple replied. "But it's rarely that simple. People kill for reasons they've convinced themselves are justified. Pride, humiliation, betrayal, jealousy may be the spark, but it's often not the only fuel." She glanced again at the body and the note. "Tell me, has anyone come forward to admit they were supposed to meet her here?" Craig shook his head. "Not yet. We're still questioning the villages. Then perhaps I shall do a bit of questioning myself," Miss Marple said, her voice light through her eyes were sharp. "If you don't mind, of course, I wouldn't dream of stopping you," Craig replied with a hint of a smile. "You'll probably find out more in an afternoon than my men could in a week." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "That's because people like to talk to old women. They don't feel threatened, but they do underestimate us, which is rather a blessing, don't you think?" Craig watched as she made her way toward the lane that led back to the village. He had worked with Miss Marple long enough to know that the case was as good as solved, though he would never admit it outright. As Miss Marple strolled down the path, her thoughts were already organizing themselves into neat little boxes, each labeled with a potential motive. There were too many unanswered questions. Who had written the note? Why had Harriet agreed to the meeting? And why had her pearls, a symbol of elegance, been broken and scattered across the ground, like discarded trinkets? The answers, she suspected, would not be hard. To find St. Mary-Me, after all, was a village that thrived on secrets. But secrets like broken pearls always had a way of coming to light with that comforting thought. She adjusted her hat and headed toward her first destination, the local post office, where the villagers would no doubt already be speculating if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned over the years. It was that where there was gossip, there was truth waiting to be uncovered. Harriet Forsyte had entered St. Mary-Me as a vision of sophistication wrapped in mystery, a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of the village. With her auburn hair that glinted like fire in the sunlight, and her impeccable wardrobe, she seemed to belong to the kind of world that existed beyond. The thatched cottages and cobblestone streets her arrival 6 months prior had been met with raised eyebrows and whispered conversations. Rumor had it that Harriet had come into money through the death of an elderly uncle who had been quite wealthy. Though the specifics of the inheritance were murky, some said she had dabbled in business. Others speculated on the possibility of a scandalous liaison. What was certain was that Harriet had quickly captured the attention of the village, particularly its men, as the bell above the door chimed, announcing Miss Marple's arrival at the local post office. The warm scent of fresh bread from the adjoining bakery filled the air behind the counter. Mrs. Price, the village bakerin, unofficial source of local gossip, was busily wrapping a loaf for a customer. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her eyes lighting up. "Come to send a letter, have you, or is it news you're after?" Miss Marple smiled, politely, a bit of both, perhaps, she said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "It's such a terrible thing. About poor Harriet Forsyte? I dare say the village must be buzzing." Mrs. Price lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Buzzing doesn't even begin to cover it. But if you ask me, I'm not entirely surprised. Harriet had her secrets do have a way of catching up with people, don't they, Miss Marple?" murmured her tone carefully. "Neutral. Did you ever notice anything usual about her recently?" Mrs. Price leaned forward as though the walls themselves might listen. "It was the gentleman callers. She said she had them wrapped around her finger. Colonel Brandon, of course, and Mr. Whitaker. He was the most possessive of the lot, always watching her, asking questions about who she was with. I saw them arguing outside the tea shop just last week. He looked furious." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Possession and jealousy," she said softly. "A most dangerous combination. Wouldn't you agree?" Mrs. Price nodded eagerly. "That man's temper was no secret, if you ask me. He was obsessed, and then there's Mr. Delaney, always blushing whenever Harriet walked by. Poor boy, but he's harmless." Still, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "Even the most seemingly harmless people can surprise us under the right circumstances. Did Harriet ever confide in you, mention anything troubling her?" Mrs. Price hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but she seemed distracted the last time she was here, nervous, like she was waiting for something. She picked up a letter, heavy paper with a London postmark. She didn't even stop to chat, which wasn't like her at all." "London," Miss Marple repeated. "Interesting. Thank you, Mrs. Price. You've been most helpful." Mrs. Price beamed. "Anything to help you do. Have a way of getting to the bottom of things, Miss Marple. I'll be curious to see what you uncover." Miss Marple left the post office with her mind racing. The mention of the London letter intrigued her. It could be a piece of the puzzle, perhaps connected to the note found at the crime scene. She resolved to learn more about Harriet's correspondence. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple passed by the tea shop, where a pair of elderly women sat near the window sipping tea and whispering excitedly. She paused briefly, catching snippets of their conversation. "They say the police found pearls scattered all around her. One of them said must have been a struggle or a lover's quarrel." The other replied, nodding knowingly. "She had plenty of those." Miss Marple continued on her way, their words lingering in her mind. Pearls, a struggle, and a quarrel. The combination hinted at a personal motive rather than a random act of violence. The pieces were beginning to align, but she needed more information. Her next destination was Colonel Brandon's cottage, who might provide insight into Harriet's last days. But even as she made her way down the familiar path, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was closer than anyone realized. Harriet's secrets had followed her to St. Mary Me, and now one of those secrets had cost her life. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and quickened her pace. The investigation was only just beginning, and she had no intention of letting any clue slip through her fingers. Chapter 2. Denial and Temper. Colonel B.R.L.'s cottage stood on the outskirts of the village, nestled among hedges that bordered a neatly kept garden. The house itself was as orderly as the colonel's reputation: whitewashed walls, ivy climbing the stone, and a front path lined with lavender that released its scent with every step Miss Marple took. She reached the oak door and tapped the brass knocker gently. The colonel himself opened the door, his military posture evident in the way. He stood shoulders squared, chin lifted, but beneath his outward composure Miss Marple detected something, a shadow of unease flickering in his eyes. Miss Marple. He greeted her warmly, stepping aside to let her in. "I suppose you've come about Harriet?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, removing her gloves and tucking them into her handbag. "Such a tragic loss. You knew her well, didn't you?" "We were friends, nothing more," the colonel said, leading her into the drawing room where a fire crackled softly. He gestured to a chair by the hearth, and Miss Marple settled into it with practiced ease. "I admired her, of course, but she had a way of drawing men in and then pushing them away, a free spirit, if ever there was one." The colonel moved to a side table and began pouring tea, his hand steady, but his gaze distant. "I was quite fond of her," he added, after a pause, as though the confession were an afterthought. "Fondness can be quite complicated, don't you think?" Miss Marple replied, accepting the cup he handed her. "Did you see her the day she died?" He hesitated just for a moment, but long enough for Miss Marple to notice. "I was at home all afternoon writing letters. I didn't go anywhere near the oak tree." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, her eyes on the colonel. "Were there any letters sent to Harriet recently? Ones perhaps you didn't deliver yourself?" The colonel's hands trembled slightly as he sat down the teapot, and Miss Marple saw it. He quickly masked the slip with a forced smile. "Not that I'm aware of, but then again, she had other suitors." He looked away, fixing his gaze on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "She kept her affairs quite private." "You know, indeed," Miss Marple said, setting her cup down gently on the saucer. "But secrets have a way of coming out, especially in St. Mary Me. Understand you and Harriet spent quite a bit of time together. Did she confide in you about any trouble she might have been in recently?" The colonel exhaled, his shoulders sagging. Slightly, "She mentioned receiving letters, threatening ones. She brushed them off as nonsense, but I could tell they frightened her. Offered to help, but Harriet was proud. She didn't want anyone interfering." "Did she show you any of the letters?" Miss Marple pressed. He shook his head. "No, but she said they were from someone she'd known before moving here, someone who wouldn't let go of the past." Miss Marple's mind sharpened at this revelation. Someone from her past, perhaps connected to the London letter Mrs. Price had mentioned earlier. She leaned forward slightly. And did she ever hint at who that someone might be? The colonel hesitated again, then shook his head once more. "No names, just someone who had become a nuisance. I assumed it was an ex-lover or someone with a grudge. Harriet had plenty of admirers after all." "She certainly did." Miss Marple agreed. She let the silence stretch between them for a moment before changing the subject. "That's a lovely walking stick by the door. Is it an heirloom?" The colonel glanced toward the hallway with a polished mahogany walking stick, leaned against the wall. "Yes, my father's. I take it with me on my morning walks." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. "I must say you've been very helpful, Colonel." He offered a weak smile. "I do hope you find out who did this. Harriet didn't deserve to die like that. No one does," Miss Marple replied, standing and reaching for her gloves. "Thank you for the tea. I won't keep you any longer." As the colonel escorted her to the door, Miss Marple's mind was already working his hesitation when mentioning the letters, the tremor in his hands, and the way he had avoided her gaze when speaking of Harriet's other suitors. Each observation was a thread she intended to unravel, but she wasn't ready to draw any conclusions just yet. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the path. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and made her way back toward the village, There were more conversations to be had more details to uncover. Colonel Brandon's denial had raised as many questions as it had answered. At the very least, she had confirmed one thing. Harriet Forsyte had been a woman with secrets, and those secrets had followed her to the grave after returning to the village with her thoughts buzzing from here. Earlier inquiries, Miss Marple decided. It was time to pay a visit to James Whittaker. She had heard enough about his volatile emotions and connection to Harriet to warrant a conversation. The artist's temper, much like the passions of any creative soul, had the potential to tip the scales of logic. If anyone harbored a motive rooted in jealousy, Whittaker seemed a likely candidate. Miss Marple approached James Whittaker's studio with measured steps, the faint scent of blooming lilacs drifting in the air. The studio itself was a small cottage, with her creeping along its stone walls and a chipped wooden door that creaked as she pushed. It opened, the faint scent of blooming lilac drifting in the air. The studio itself was a small cottage with ivy creeping along its stone walls and a chipped wooden door that creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the smell of turpentine linseed oil and paint filled the air, as though the walls themselves exhaled the essence of an artist's labor. Miss Marple Whittaker greeted her from across the room, wiping his hands on a rag stained with streaks of crimson and ochre. His tone was neither warm nor polite, more a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "I assume you're here to accuse me of something." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, sweetly, her gaze sweeping over the unfinished canvases leaning against the walls. "I only wanted to ask about your relationship with Harriet Forsyte." Whit's face darkened as he tossed the rag onto a nearby table. "She used me like she used everyone, but I loved her even when she flirted with other men right in front of me." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And how did that make you feel, Mr. Whittaker?" she asked gently, her voice as soft as the rustle of leaves. His response was immediate and volatile. He slammed his hand onto the table, making the brushes in a nearby jar clatter angry. "Of course, how else would I feel? She made me feel like I was nothing. She knew exactly how to play her games. One moment, she'd be praising my work, and the next, she'd be laughing at something Colonel Brandon had said as though I didn't exist." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but unreadable emotions can be overwhelming, especially when they involve someone as captivating as Harriet. "Did you see her the day she died?" Whittaker hesitated, his fingers curling into fists before he forced them to relax. "I was here all evening, painting. I didn't leave the studio, I see," Miss Marple murmured. She walked slowly around the room, her eyes lingering on a half-finished portrait of Harriet. Her likeness stared back at her from the canvas, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes filled with a teasing glint. "You captured her well," Miss Marple commented. "It's a very evocative portrayal. When did you last work on this piece?" Whittaker exhaled sharply. "A week ago. I couldn't bring myself to finish it, not after the argument." Miss Marple stopped in her tracks and turned to face him. "The argument outside the tea shop. Mrs. Price mentioned seeing you two quarreling. What was it about, if you don't mind me asking?" His jaw tightened. "She was planning to leave for London. She said it was only for a few days, but I knew better. She had no intention of coming back. Harriet wasn't the type to stay put for long," I accused her of running off with one of her other suitors, probably that insufferable Brandon. She denied it, of course, but I knew she was lying. "And what happened after that?" Miss Marple pressed. "She walked away," said his voice bitter. "She always had the last word. I went back to my studio and tried to paint, but all I could think about was her laughing at me, mocking me." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "And yet you loved her," she observed quietly. "Even after everything I did," he admitted, sinking into a chair and burying his face in his hands. "I couldn't help it, but I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. I may have been angry, but I'm not a murderer." She approached him slowly, resting a hand on the back of his chair. "Anger is a natural response, Mr. Whittaker, but sometimes in the heat of the moment people do things they never imagined themselves capable of. Are you sure you didn't go after her that night perhaps to make her listen one last time?" He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and defiance. "No, I swear I stayed here. If you need proof, you can check with my neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher. She heard me pacing in my studio until well past midnight. I couldn't sleep." Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Fletcher, thank you for your honesty, Mr. Whitaker. I appreciated one more question. If you don't mind, did Harriet mention receiving any letters recently? He frowned as though trying to recall. Yes, actually she received one the day we argued. It upset her. I asked her about it, but she wouldn't say much, just that it was from someone she used to know. In London, did she happen to show it to you? No. But she looked frightened, and Harriet wasn't easily frightened. Whoever wrote that letter had power over her. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled as she digested the new information. The mention of the letter fit perfectly with what she had already learned from Mrs. Price and Colonel Brandon. But there was still something about was temper that troubled her. "You've been working hard, I see," she said, glancing around the room once more. But emotions, Whitaker, have a way of creeping into the heart and spilling over. "If there's anything you haven't told me, I suggest you do so. Now I've told you everything," he said firmly, standing to escort her to the door. "And if you find out who really did this, I'll be the first to thank you. Harriet deserved better than this, indeed," Miss Marple replied, stepping outside. "Goodbye, Mr. Whitaker. I do hope you find some peace," as the door closed behind her. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and set off down the lane. There were pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but something about Whitaker's story still didn't sit right. His emotions were too raw, too close to the surface. She would visit Mrs. Fletcher next, but in her heart, Miss Marple knew that jealousy, pride, and desperation were circling this case like Vault S. The question was which of them had finally swooped down to claim Harriet Forsyte's life. Chapter 3. The Diary of the Dead. Earlier that morning, Miss Marple had paid a visit to Mrs. Fletcher, the neighbor James Whitaker had mentioned as his alibi. Mrs. Fletcher greeted her with a guarded expression and a tone as cold as the morning dew. When Miss Marr inquired about the evening in question, Mrs. Fletcher's answers were vague and evasive, as though rehearsed. Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the way her hands fidgeted and her eyes darted toward the mantelpiece clock. It was as if the woman were hiding something or had been persuaded to do so. Without pressing further, Miss Marple thanked her politely and left, deciding that the answers she sought lay elsewhere. The day was crisp and clear as Miss Marple made her way to Harriet Forsyte's cottage. Her steps light, but her mind weighed down by the fragments of evidence she had gathered so far. The path leading to the cottage was lined with hydrangeas. Their blooms faded with the passing season. Much like the charm Harriet had once held over the village, Superintendent Craix was waiting for her by the gate, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild frustration. "I assume you're ready for a thorough search," Miss Marple Craix said as he opened the door for her. "Quite ready, Superintendent," she replied, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The air inside the cottage was heavy with the scent of lavender mingled with the faint traces of Harriet's favorite perfume. It was as if her presence still lingered, a silent reminder of the life she had led and the secrets she had kept. The search began, with Craig taking the front parlor. While Miss Marple examined Harriet's bedroom, the room was immaculately kept with a neatly made bead of vanity, adorned with silver brushes and a wardrobe that spoke of refined taste. But it was the dressing table that caught Miss Marple's attention. She ran her fingers lightly along its edge, pausing at a small drawer that seemed slightly misaligned. "Superintendent," she called softly, "I believe I may have found something." Craig joined her, watching as she carefully opened the drawer. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of lace handkerchiefs, was a small leather-bound diary. K's eyes widened. "Well, that's promising. Let's see what secrets it holds." He opened the diary and began flipping through its pages, his brow furrowing. "It's coded," he observed, turning the book toward Miss Marple. "Look at this. Letters, numbers, symbols." Miss Marple adjusted her glasses and studied the page. "Ah, yes, a simple cipher. I believe Harriet was clever, but she wasn't a professional cryptographer, if I'm correct. Should be easy to decipher. Let's try a substitution method with a practiced hand." She began tracing her finger over the symbols, whispering to herself as she worked. Within minutes, she had decoded a line that made her pause. "Look here," she said, pointing to the entry. "J has become too possessive. I fear he will ruin me. I must end it. KK. Expression darkened. J must be James Whittaker. She knew. He was dangerous, she did. Miss Marple agreed, tapping the diary thoughtfully, but knowing and avoiding two different things. She underestimated how far jealousy could push a man. Craig flipped to another entry and read aloud. The letter came. Today I can't believe he found me here. He knows too much. If I don't meet him, he'll tell everyone. That could be the letter James Whittaker mentioned. Miss Marple said the one that frightened her, but there's something else Harriet didn't mention. Who wrote it? Only that this person found her. It might not be Whittaker at all. Crack's gaze sharpened. Then who else could it be? Brandon? Perhaps he was fond of her, and if he thought she betrayed him, perhaps. Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. But Colonel Brandon doesn't seem the type to threaten. He's old-fashioned, yes, but not vindictive. This letter sounds more desperate. She continued flipping through the diary, her eyes scanning each entry, until she reached one dated just a few days before Harriet's death. Here, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. I must meet him at the oak tree. He says it will be the last time, but I don't believe him. I'm so tired of running. Craig straightened. That confirms it. She went to the oak tree to meet someone. She feared someone who had leverage over her. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. But fear and leverage don't always point to a lover. They can just as easily point to someone with financial control, or someone who knows a dangerous secret. Harriet's life was not as simple as it seemed. Craig rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So our suspects remain Whittaker and Brandon, but perhaps there's a third person we've overlooked. Harriet had a way of attracting trouble. She did. Miss Marple agreed, closing the diary gently. But the answer will lie in the connections. If this person wrote the letter, followed her to the oak tree, and knew enough about her fears to use them against her, then they must have been close. Crack's face was grim. We'll need to question Whittaker again. His temper, his jealousy, it all fits. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. It fits, yes, but I wonder if it fits too perfectly. Sometimes when a suspect is so obvious, it's because someone wants them to be. We mustn't overlook the possibility. Craig considered her words. Then we'll dig deeper. But if Whittaker didn't kill her, who did? Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt. As he spoke, that superintendent is what we're about to find out. But we're closer now. Harriet's secrets are leading us to the truth. They lingered inside the cottage for a moment longer, ensuring no stone was left unturned before stepping outside into the fresh village air. Miss Marple felt the weight of the diary in her handbag, its contents, both tragic and revealing the image of Harriet, vibrant and flawed, lingered in her mind. She had been a woman of charm and contradictions, and now even in death she continued to weave a complex web. Miss Marple turned to Craig and lowered her voice. We must act quickly before the suspects grow too comfortable. If wedlock, they may destroy vital evidence or flee. I suggest a meeting, one that forces their hand. Craig nodded in understanding. A gathering where they won't know what to expect but won't dare refuse. Where do you suggest we host it? The vicarage, Miss App said decisively. It's central, neutral, and holds an air of seriousness. Send word that we've uncovered a new clue related to the diary, a clue that could expose the killer. Craig raised a brow. They'll come then, if only to protect themselves. But once they're there, what next? Miss Marple smiled gently, as though discussing the arrangement of a tea party rather than a confrontation. We let them stew. Each word, each glance will betray something. Under pressure, the guilty party will reveal themselves. They always do. The air inside the village hall was thick with tension, as though the walls themselves absorbed the unease of its occupants. A single chandelier hung above, casting flickering shadows across the room. The Vika's modest, usually home to garden club meetings and charity auctions, had never seen such a gathering as this. Colonel Brandon sat stiffly in a chair near the front, his gaze focused on the wooden floor as though contemplating an invisible chessboard. James Whittaker lounged by the window, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the sill. Mrs. Price had taken a seat near the back, clutching her handbag tightly. All eyes eventually drifted to Miss Marple, who stood serenely at the front of the room, her lace-gloved hands resting on the back of a chair. Superintendent Craig stood beside her, occasionally glancing at the suspects he had delivered the invitations under the pretense of sharing a major breakthrough. In Harriet Forsythe's murder investigation, the suspects had arrived promptly, curiosity and anxiety pulling them like puppets on strings. "Thank you all for coming." Miss Marple began, her voice soft yet commanding enough to silence the whispers. "I know. You must be wondering why we've asked you here today. Harriet Forsythe's death was not a simple accident or a random act of violence. It was the result of carefully layered motives: pride, jealousy, fear, and betrayal. And tonight we intend to uncover the truth." James Whittaker's hand stilled against the window frame. Colonel Brandon shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the cuffs of his jacket. Miss Marple continued, her eyes sweeping the room. "We know that Harriet was entangled. With several admirers, she had a way of capturing hearts but leaving them wounded when her affections waned. But only one of those admirers had the motive and opportunity to end her life." She gestured to Craig, who stepped forward with a box containing several key pieces of evidence with practiced precision. He laid them out on a table: Harriet's the note found near her body, and a small glass jar containing soil samples. "Let's begin with the diary," Miss Marple said, lifting the leather-bound book delicately. Harriet was careful to keep her secrets coded, but even codes can be broken. And once they are, they reveal fascinating insights. For instance, her relationship with Mr. Whittaker, an artist of considerable talent but considerable temper, too. Whittaker's face flushed. "If you're suggesting I killed her, you're wrong. Yes, I was angry. She played with my emotions, but that doesn't make me a murderer." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but her gaze was piercing. "You say that now, Mr. Whittaker, but what did you feel when you saw her walk away after your argument at the tea shop? What did you feel when she told you she was leaving for London, abandoning your work and your actions?" Whittaker opened his mouth to respond, but Miss Marple cut him off gently. "Let me remind you of Harriet's diary entry. Jay has become too possessive. I fear he will ruin me. I must end it. She feared you, Mr. Whittaker, and with good reason. You admitted to being jealous and angry. You had the opportunity." Whittaker's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening. "I didn't kill her," he said through gritted teeth. "Yes, I met her to the oak tree. Yes, I confronted her, but it wasn't supposed to end like that. I just wanted her to listen. She kept laughing at me, like I was some joke. His voice broke, and for a moment the hall was deathly silent before Miss Marple could respond. The door to the village hall creaked open and Mr. Delaney stepped inside. His face pale, but determined. The room collectively turned toward him, startled by the interruption. "Mr. Delaney?" CIC asked, surprised. Delaney adjusted his cap nervously and cleared his throat. "I've been listening from outside. Admitted, and I can't stay silent anymore. James Whittaker didn't kill her. I saw everything with my own eyes. It was Colonel Brandon." The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Colonel Brandon stood abruptly, his face drained of color. "That's a lie." Delaney's voice rose over the noise. "I admired Harriet deeply ever since she arrived in the village. I followed her that night because I knew she was meeting someone. I wanted to protect her, but I stayed hidden behind the trees when I saw Whittaker arrive." They argued. "Yes, but he didn't hurt her. He left angry and frustrated, but unharmed and unaware of what was about to happen next. And then Brandon appeared. He wasn't there to comfort her. He was there to confront her. I saw him strike her in a fit of rage. She fell, and by the time I ran to her side, it was too late." Whittaker looked up, his eyes wide. I didn't know. I thought maybe it was my fault for leaving her alone." Miss Marple raised a hand to quiet the room. "Thank you, Mr. Delaney. Your testimony is important and it corroborates the evidence we've gathered." She turned to Brandon, her gaze unwavering. "You followed her, didn't you, Colonel? You knew Whittaker's confrontation would weaken her resolve, and you used that moment to force her into staying. But when she refused, you lost control." Brandon's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he appeared defeated. Then, with sudden energy, he stood. "What if they're lying?" he said, pointing at Whittaker and Delaney. His voice was frantic now, desperate to find a way out. "They're trying to pin this on me. Whitaker had every reason to kill her after she humiliated him, and Delaney's been obsessed with her. They're working together to frame me. I didn't do it. Miss Marple shook her head gently, her gaze unwavering. No, Colonel. The evidence is clear. Saw you strike her. Whitaker may have confronted Harriet, but he left her alive. The soil on your walking stick places you at the scene, the diary, and the confrontation created the perfect storm. But you. Colonel delivered the final blow. Colonel Brandon's face twisted with frustration, and he slammed his hand against the table. That's not my walking stick. My walking stick was stolen. I haven't seen it in days, he shouted, his tone growing increasingly aggressive. Miss Marple turned toward Craig and nodded. Crack, if you please. The superintendent stepped forward and explained. I retrieved the walking stick myself last night after Miss Marple suggested it might be important. We went quietly, so as not to alert you. The stick was hidden near the back door of your cottage, Colonel Brandon. When we examined it, the soil on the tip matched exactly with the ground beneath. The oak tree, Mrs. Price gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Colonel Brandon's lips tightened into a thin line. You're mistaken, he said quietly. I hadn't been near that tree in weeks. The soil could have come from anywhere. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Colonel. The soil sample is specific to that location. Moist, rich in clay, and containing fragments of acorns. It matches exactly. You followed Harriet to the oak tree after Wah left, didn't you? You had already heard about their argument. You knew her guard would be down. She trusted you. And when you realized she planned to leave you behind as well, you acted. This is nonsense. Brandon snapped. I loved her. I wanted to help her. Yes, Miss Marple said, softly, but you couldn't bear to be discarded like the others. Harriet saw you as a stable option, but she was never truly yours, was she? When she told you she was leaving, you panicked. Brandon's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he appeared defeated. Then with sudden energy he stood. I didn't mean to kill her, he said, his voice breaking. I just wanted to stop her from leaving. She laughed when I begged her to stay, and he buried his face in his hands. It all happened so quickly. Craig stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the colonel's shoulder. It's over, Brandon. Miss Marple sighed, her gaze softening as she watched the broken man before her. It wasn't jealousy alone that led to this tragedy. It was wounded pride and desperation, two of the most dangerous emotions Harriet had a way of inspiring. Both as Craig escorted Brandon out of the hall, the remaining villagers sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple turned to the group. Let this be a lesson, she said gently. When emotions fester unchecked, they can lead to disastrous outcomes. Harriet's beauty may have drawn admirers, but it was her secrets that led to her downfall. The room emptied slowly. Leaving Miss Marple alone by the window, she gazed out at the village, its familiar rooftops bathed in the light of the setting sun. Another mystery had been solved, but the cost, as always, was steep. Poor Harriet, she murmured to herself. She played the game too well. And in the end it played her. Chapter 4, closure at the oak tree with Colonel Brandon taken into custody. The village hall slowly emptied, leaving Miss Marple and Superintendent Craig to reflect on the events that transpired. As the last of the onlookers departed, Miss Marple gathered her shawl around her shoulders, and the two set off silently toward the oak tree. The walk was peaceful, save for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind threaded its way through the trees. The moon hung high, casting silvery beams of light across the path, illuminating the ancient oak that had borne witness to Harriet Forsyte's tragic end. When they arrived, Miss Marple paused, her gaze drifting upward toward the branches that swayed gently in the night. The air here felt heavier, as if the tree itself mourned Harriet's fate. Craig, standing a few paces behind her, broke the silence. It's strange how quiet it is now, isn't it? After everything, Miss Marple nodded. Death has a way of silencing everything. Dear Craig, even the secrets people hope to bury. She walked slowly around the tree, her eyes scanning the ground as if searching for some final clue she might have missed. It's a pity, she said softly, stopping at the spot where Harriet's body had been found. Harriet was a woman of spirit, but she trusted the wrong man. Jealousy, superintendent, is often the most dangerous motive of all. It has a way of twisting love into something unrecognizable. Craig sighed, his hands resting on his hips. And once again, you saw what others didn't. I was so focused on Whitaker and his outbursts that I almost missed the quiet desperation of Colonel Brandon. You were right about him. He wasn't violent by nature, but desperation can make even the most honorable man dangerous. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the tree. Not at all, my dear CIC, I merely understood human nature. People often think of killers as monstrous, but most of them are quite ordinary. It's emotions that drive them, emotions they can't control or understand until it's too late. Brandon's pride and fear of rejection clouded his judgment. He didn't plan to kill Harriet, simply couldn't bear to lose her. Do you think he regrets it now? Craig asked, leaning against the tree. Oh, undoubtedly, Miss Marple replied. But a regret doesn't undo what's been done. I expect he'll think about it every day for the rest of his life. Craig exhaled heavily as thought. The weight of the case had finally settled on his shoulders. What about Whitaker? Do you think he'll ever forgive himself for not walking away when he had the chance? Miss Marple considered this. James Whitaker is a man driven by passion and pride. He may try to convince himself that he was a victim of circumstance, but deep down he knows he played a role in Harriet's downfall. Whether he forgives himself or not depends on whether he can confront his own flaws. Harriet was the spark that ignited many tempers. She wasn't the only cause of the fire. The two stood in silence for a moment, the oak tree towering over them like a sentinel guarding the village's secrets. The shadows cast by its branches danced on the ground, shifting with the breeze as if replaying the final moments of Harriet's life. I can't help but wonder, Craig said, breaking the silence, what Harriet's life would have been like if she hadn't come here, if she'd stayed in London or gone somewhere far away. Miss Marple signed. Perhaps she would have lived longer, but people like Harriet often find themselves in trouble. No matter where they go, she was a woman who thrived on attention and risk. She lived as she wanted, but such a life often comes with a price. Craig glanced at her. Do you ever feel sorry for people like her? I do, Miss Marple admitted, because beneath her charm and confidence, Harriet was vulnerable. She thought she could control the men in her life, but in the end, they controlled her. Fate, she underestimated the power of wounded pride. A light breeze stirred the branches above, and Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It's a lesson for all of us. I think pride and jealousy are powerful forces, and if left unchecked, they can lead even the most ordinary of people to do terrible things. Craig nodded thoughtfully. What will you do now, Miss Marple? Back to knitting and village gossip. She chuckled softly. For a time, yes, but there's always something new to observe, and the human heart remains as complex as ever. One can learn a great deal just by listening. They turned to leave, their footsteps light against the soft earth as they walked back toward the village. The oak tree stood silently behind them, its leaves whispering secrets to the night before they parted ways. Craig placed a hand on Miss Marple's shoulder. I couldn't have solved this without you. Oh, nonsense, Miss Marple said with a wave of her hand. You would have gotten there eventually. But sometimes it helps to have an old woman who knows a thing or two about people. Craig laughed. Well, if I ever find myself in another mess like this, I'll know who to call. Miss Marple smiled warmly. I'll be here, dear. Craig's Mary. Me always has more mysteries waiting to unfold. As Craig disappeared down the path, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind already turning over the events of the past few days. She had seen the best and worst of human nature, but the village, as always, would carry on. She lit a small lamp by her window and picked up her knitting outside. The world was quiet, but within her the threads of Harriet Forsyte's story were neatly tied off like the final stitch in a pattern. And with that, she set her needles clicking, ready to face whatever mysteries awaited her next. Thank you for tuning in to Cafe Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.